Hey everyone, my name's Andy Carvell. I'm partner at a company called Phiture. We're a mobile growth consultancy here in Berlin. You might know me from the Mobile Growth Stack, which is a framework which I published back in 2014 and that we continue to develop and publish updates to at Phiture. In my kind of former life, I was a mobile games developer. I've actually been working in mobile for around about 20 years now. Longer than I care to admit. I'm still super excited about mobile. I was really excited about mobile when I first started my career at Nokia making games, because of the tremendous potential for sort of disruption and for connecting of people across the world. And I still see massive amount of innovation in the mobile sector, and it's still a really exciting place to work. So that's why I'm still here. And these days, I'm working at Phiture, helping a bunch of different companies around the world with their mobile growth challenges. At Phiture we focus on a couple of things quite specifically. We don't do everything. We're not trying to be a full service agency. We work with some of the companies that you see here. And we have a couple of teams that are sort of scaled around a couple of the key growth challenges that our whole thesis is that we can sort of build systems and processes to tackle some of the sort of core challenges in mobile growth. And scale teams around those and deliver those kind of programs in a structured way to the kind of companies that you see there. So we typically get involved with companies when they're sort of at a bit sort of later stage. We don't tend to work with really early stage companies. They tend to actually have a problem with product market fit primarily, and they think they need growth, but actually they need to work on the product for a bit. We tend to come in a little bit later and help teams to get a bit more structured and a bit more systematic and data-driven about growth. So today I'm going to talk about retention and engagement primarily. Also, I've got a couple of slides on conversion. And I'm going to talk about how you can leverage mobile CRM as a lever. So I'm going to talk about some key strategies for improving engagement and retention particularly, and a little bit on conversion, and which strategies are kind of maybe best aligned with mobile CRM. But I just want to set the scene very quickly. Hopefully I shouldn't need to spend too long explaining why retention is something that is important for a mobile app, but still in this day and age, I do see a lot of companies that are very focused on acquisition, and they're maybe like this chart that you see on the bottom, where we see that on the top line growth, if you're just looking at like the overall user numbers, active user numbers, then you might think that this company on the bottom is doing okay because the user numbers are growing more or less. But what you see, below the line is the amount of churn. So, like what you see on the bottom there is a company that's being propped up by a massive amount of paid acquisition. Companies get addicted to just buying more users, throwing them into essentially a leaky bucket. What you see on the top is a much more healthy situation where you've got good retention. You're retaining the majority of users. Some are going to churn for sure, but over time, because you're retaining users and then acquiring healthy cohorts on top, like you get this nice hockey stick growth curve and compound growth. So this is, of course, why people are very keen to improve the retention of their mobile app. And at Phiture, we have a retention team that focuses a lot on this problem of like how to improve retention, and we've been working on this for a couple of years with a bunch of really cool apps. To really kind of systemize this approach and to use mobile CRM as a lever for increasing retention. Now, I just want to call out that CRM is not like a cure-all, right? It's one important tool which can open up a bunch of channels and a bunch of tactics which are going to be very useful in improving engagement and retention. But engagement starts with an engaging product. If you don't have an engaging product, if you don't have that product market fit, then there's no point like sending a bunch of emails and push notifications. You're just going to annoy users even more. If they're already having a bad experience. But if they're having a good experience, or at least a decent chunk of them are, then you can start to think about layering these channels and tactics on top to get to like a better level of impact and really like move up your metrics. So today I'm going to just call out a few kind of key strategies which are like strategic goals, which you might want to focus on when you're looking to improve your engagement and retention. And I'll call out some tactics and best practice, some stuff that we've built and some stuff that we see working well in the marketplace that other apps have built. So before I get into those specific strategies, I just want to kind of take a moment just to talk about active users and activity in general. So what you see on the bottom here, I think is a really nice, clear schematic, which just makes it like really clear what we're talking about when we talk about active users, right? Like whenever you acquiring users, you've got a bunch of new users. Either those new users churn right away in that period. So let's say you're looking at like month to month. You know, any new users you've acquired in that month, they're new users for that month, and then they either become active users in the next month, or they already become dormant, right? And it's actually quite common that a lot of users that you acquire will go straight to dormant. But hopefully a decent chunk of them become active users. And then the challenge is keeping them active, right? And if they do churn, you've got a possibility to resurrect or reactivate them, although reactivation is pretty tough. And what you see on the top here, this is a framework that I put together in collaboration with a company called CleverTap. They have a mobile engagement platform. And I call this the AIC framework, so acknowledgement, interest, and conversion. It's essentially kind of a zoomed-in version of that monthly active user bucket that you see in the bottom. So it's really, you can think about active users being like different levels of engagement. And here I'm kind of stratifying it into three different buckets. Acknowledgement being that they at least open the app or maybe interact with some of your messaging, but they're not really showing any sort of higher engagement than that. They're not really doing much in the app. This interest layer being like any of the kind of actions which you would like the user to take, and it shows like some level of engagement and interest. Maybe they're viewing content or clicking around the app, maybe engaging with certain features, but not necessarily doing the core action or like delivering the core value that you really hope. And then you've got your kind of power users in that kind of top bucket, the conversion bucket. Conversion doesn't necessarily mean that they're buying things. You might not be selling things directly in your app, but conversion in this context really means the core action, the thing that's delivering value and creating value in your app and delivering value for the user as well. And so ideally you want to be growing that bucket. Okay, so when we think about the sort of common strategies, and I've broken out here the strategies which I think are most applicable to CRM. There's a few other things you might want to do when you think about improving engagement and retention. For example, you might want to really deepen overall engagement. And for that, it's typically you're working on the product itself. You may be building out new features and things, making new ways for the user to interact with the product. So I'm not going to talk about those things today. I'm really going to focus on these set of strategies, which I think are all really, really good candidates for using CRM, so like push, in-app, email, possibly even SMS or retargeting. You can use these channels to effectively implement a strategy of any of these things, and I'm going to go through them in order. Yeah, just quickly on the retention curve here. Probably a lot of you are familiar already with retention curves, but well, again, we have another example here of like good versus bad retention. You see the green line there, which is demonstrating good retention. Couple of things I just want to call out there. So first of all, that retention curve is leveling off. Like, well, first of all, it's leveling off a much higher up on the graph, which means like a larger percentage of users are actually sticking around. But the other important thing is that it's actually flattening, which means that after a certain number of months, like you can be pretty sure that at least a certain percentage of users are sticking around, and that they're likely to stick around for like a pretty long time. What we see on the blue line, it's actually a more typical case, particularly for a sort of a lot of apps. This is more like what the retention curve looks like, which means that if you keep a user, if you're looking at a user cohort who installed on a particular date, eventually that cohort will dwindle to zero. The people that are still around after 8-9 months, it's getting smaller and smaller. It's never leveling off, which means that there's not even a small segment of those cohorts that are sticking around for the long term. So that indicates a kind of a more terminal problem with retention. Maybe something that you can fix with CRM, or it might be that there's actually more indicative of more significant product changes that you need to make. But in any case, like this green line, much healthier retention curve, and this is the kind of thing you should be aiming for, like that it flattens out at some point, and then it becomes a challenge of like moving that curve as high up as it can, so it flattens out like further up that graph. So typically, there's a big opportunity in activation. I always say this. If you've seen one of my other talks, I always talk a bit about activation. I'm just going to go back to the previous slide. We can see this big drop-off between like day 0 and day 1. That's absolutely typical. And that's the same shape basically for every app in the world. Just depends like where it levels off. But you'll always lose a lot of users between the first session even, never mind the first day, but like, you know, a lot of users won't come back after just opening the app once. So you have a big challenge there, and that challenge is in activation. So a few things that can work well on a tactical level and applying CRM to actually improve your activation. These are a few things which we've seen working well and that we've implemented with companies to help them improve. So first thing is, I just want to call out this this funnel up at the top. So we do a lot of funnel analysis. I think the first thing you need to do when you're looking to improve your activation and your onboarding, well, actually the first thing you need to do is decide what activation even means, right? So like, what is it that you're trying to get users to do that you would consider them to be an active user? And that's maybe a more complex question than you think. A lot of apps don't even really know, like, you know, what is that activation step? And what you should look at really is, you know, what is the action that they take where they're really going to experience some real value from the app? They're going to really understand what the app's all about. And hopefully they're going to take that action again and again once they've done it once, right? And that's, you can look at the data to see, you know, like, what are those core actions? And you should have an idea when you've built your app, like, what is the action that's going to really drive the most value? But actually, like, some people and some companies still don't have a good handle on that. But once you've kind of got an idea of, like, okay, what do you want to drive people to? What do you consider to be activation? So in the case of FishBrain, for example, it's logging your first catch. It's a fishing app, social fishing app. It's all about showing people that you've caught a fish, and you post your picture of the fish that you've caught, and and people comment on it and stuff. It's basically like Instagram for fishing. Believe it or not, it's very popular. And you know, with the example you see on the bottom here, this is Channelist. It's like a video and TV show and movie tracking app, which means that you can discover stuff that's like being shown on different streaming services like Netflix, Amazon Prime, etc. And you can also track the movies that you track the TV shows that you've watched. Like, people like to keep a note of, like, you know, how many episodes of certain series they've watched, things like this. And so there, like, the kind of activation step was like adding a couple of like movies into your watch list to say, okay, like, yeah, I want to watch this, or tracking a couple of TV shows. Like, there were actually, depending on the use case, there were like different activation steps. But you're always going to end up like with a kind of a funnel. And this is a very simple funnel that I've got at the top here. In this particular example, you know, there's three things that a user has to do before they're considered activated. So signing up, joining a community, and posting their first comment, right? So this is a kind of a social app, just an example. The key thing is here, by looking at this funnel, you can really identify, okay, where are the areas you might want to focus on if you want to actually try and improve the activation rate. And we can see there's a huge drop-off between the first and the second step. So, like, if you're, as a growth marketer, wanting to improve that activation rate, you'd really want to focus on that step between signing up and joining the community. And actually, there would be a step before that. I've just realized that this is not a great example, because there's probably actually a whole bunch of users who are not signing up at all. So that funnel actually starts a little further back when they first open the app. So there's probably another drop-off there. But you want to look at, like, where the biggest drop-offs are in your activation funnel. Actually, if you see, like, between the second and the third step, there's not much of a drop-off at all. So you wouldn't actually spend a lot of time there. You can see that if you do get them to join a community, they're quite likely to comment. So given that you sort of identified those drop-offs and the points in that funnel where you see the biggest upside, you can then start to sort of approach that user with targeted messaging to try and drive up those those activation rates. So rather than looking at just your overall activation rate, you can look at actually micro optimizations within that activation funnel. Like, some apps have actually a very big multi-step funnel with a lot of things you have to do in your activation flow. So here's just a couple of examples. One is from Channelist, where it's actually trying to understand what is the use case that the users come in for, because it's actually solving a couple of different problems, and it's important for them to understand which of the problems it's trying to solve. And this is actually implemented with an in-app message. So this is not part of the native UI. This is something that can be tested and iterated on very quickly in the CRM tool. So it's deployed as a simple in-app survey. It asks the user, what are you here to do? Is it discover TV shows or movies, or is it to track your favorite shows? And depending on whether they want to discover or track, they're taken into a different onboarding flow, which is hopefully going to improve those micrometrics along the funnel. An example from FishBrain here, it's a push notification. This is something that we call a onboarding win-back campaign. So again, it's looking at like where there's a drop-off in the funnel. In this case, like, there's a big drop-off between setting up your Fishbrain account and logging your first catch. But then we also see like the logging the catch process is actually like a multi-step process. So you have to upload a picture of your fish. You have to input some data about the fish. Yeah, and so there's several steps to it. And we see that some people, like, they start the process and then they drop off. So what we implemented for Fishbrain is if we see people who started logging a catch but never finished, we actually like send them this push notification after about some minutes or maybe an hour, and say, hey, maybe you got distracted, like, come back and finish logging your catch. And that really improved the logging catch rate, which is the kind of key step for activation. So you can consider this something like an abandoned cart kind of model, right? It's the same principle. You don't need to think about that just in terms of somebody put an actual item in a shopping basket. It can be for actually any part of your engagement, any of your key funnels. You can use this same kind of tactic. Okay, I better speed up a bit because I've only got 9 minutes left. And as usual, I've got like way too many slides. But I just want to kind of go a little bit deeper on this survey thing, because I really think that in-app messages in particular are really killer for being able, for a growth marketer to be able to get information from the user, which you can then use to like real-time segment those users in a more meaningful way. You can collect a lot of intent and really understand that user better, and then immediately use that data to then customize, put them into different CRM tracks, different kinds of messaging, based on what they've told you. So instead of trying to guess what the user's there for, just ask them. And this is exactly, again, another example from, I think this is from Fishbrain. Yeah, so sending a push notification to ask them to come in and complete a survey. Then we're asking them again, like, why are they there? What are their kind of key intents? And from that, that's really like useful information that can also be passed on to like, the product and the research team. But it can also be used right away with the growth marketers, because it's storing this stuff against the user. It stores their responses as a user attribute, which means you can immediately start segmenting and personalizing their subsequent messaging based on what they've told you. This is incredibly powerful. Okay, so another strategy you might have, like, let's say your activation rate's okay, and actually you see that what you really want to do is try and get people more active in the app, using the app more times in a given period, and more times a week or more times a day. Then there's a bunch of tactics that can work well there. Activity notifications are a great one. This is like notifying the user about things that are happening outside of like what they've done in the app. So it's like typically social notifications, like Facebook's really good at these, telling you when somebody else has commented or liked or done something. Social apps are very rich for activity notifications. For other apps, you need to work a bit harder. But content platforms work really well. You can always tell people about new content that's been uploaded to the platform. I did a lot of that at SoundCloud when I was running the growth team there. And like also just kind of stats summaries and things like this, kind of light gamification, or just sort of giving people a good indication of progress can be really helpful as well. This example on the right is from Whistle. It's a dog tracking app. So you have like a physical device that tracks your dog's activity, and then it gives you like a summary. Oh, it's like, the dog's been super active this week, or, and she has like a goal that she has to hit in terms of like how much exercise she gets. And, getting these kind of reminders can also like bring people back into the app and get them to be like more active more often. And the more contextual you can be, the more personalized you can be, as always, like that works well. Hooking into like external APIs can be a great way to personalize and contextualize activity notifications when you're not in such a rich environment as a social app. Social apps are great because they have loads of activity all the time, but you have to work a bit harder with some apps. And using things like weather, or possibly even calendar, it's a certain day or something like this. You need to work a bit harder, but there's usually something external which you can use as a trigger and a good reason to get back in touch with the user. Now, driving feature adoption, typically, it could be that, there's a brand new feature and the team just wants to push that feature to make people aware of it. But actually, more often than not, what we see is that quite often when we look at the activity data for a particular app, we're looking at the analytics, what we see is that some of the features which are driving the most retention among the users who are using it. So in other words, if we see people who use a certain feature are much more likely to be retained than those who don't. But then we also see that the people who are exposed to that feature, the people who actually use it even once, typically, often sometimes below 50%. So in other words, there's a huge upside there. If you can get more people to be exposed to that feature, what we see is typically that they're more likely to be retained once they get using it. So feature education, even of existing features, driving up that feature adoption, needs to begin with, first of all, having that understanding of the current level of exposure of certain features to users. But if you see a feature that's underexposed, particularly if you see it's highly correlated with longer term retention, then you can start to do these kind of flows where you may be starting off with a push notification, bringing them in, hitting them with a bit more information with an in-app message, and then they can choose whether they want to even go deeper, in which case they can hit learn more and then maybe go to a website or get an email in their inbox with more information. So these kind of multi-channel education flows we find work really well. This example on the right, another one from Fishbrain. They're actually one of my favorites to use examples for. This is one that we did, which actually leverages a weather API to point people towards the weather forecast feature within the app itself. So we know it's going to be raining in that user's geo, and then we can send a nice personalized message like this. It's going to be, this one's windy actually, not rainy, but so it's saying it's going to be windy there. And then, when they actually see that it was windy that day, they're like, oh, wow, yeah, that's pretty cool. I'm going to go check out that weather forecast. That worked really well for actually driving up interaction with the forecast feature. Another one from Headspace here. So this is just an example from using email to really educate users about their new sleep feature, which again, we saw was actually very highly correlated with people sticking around if they actually used the sleep feature, but it was a bit underutilized. Yeah, as always with Headspace, they always have beautiful visuals, and they did a really nice this is two parts of the same email, basically just a nice long feature education. Now, reactivation and churn prevention, it's always really tough, right? And the challenge is when you see, you might see, okay, we've got 2 million users who, once used the app and they're not there anymore. You need to also think about whether they were activated in the first place. Did they actually activate and then become dormant, or did they just open the app once, never really activate, and then become dormant? Because then actually there are two different groups. One is an unactivated group, which you need to treat differently with different kinds of messaging, versus your just truly dormant user group who maybe churned away for some other reason. And it's tough to understand the reasons why people churn. Because they often won't tell you, they'll just disappear, right? But I really encourage everybody who's got an app and wants to improve reactivation, which is a hard problem anyway. You really need to actually talk to users who've abandoned the app and understand why. You need to actually get some qualitative information. It's not something you can see from your analytics necessarily. But yeah, anyway, a couple of specific tactics which can work well. Don't be afraid to use psychological tactics. So we've got the tearful owl here. I kind of want to go back and use Duolingo, and it's crying in a puddle of its own tears. And yeah, the example here. Also, don't be afraid to be a bit cheeky. I mean, you've probably lost the user anyway. You don't want them to actually flag you as spam in their email. So you have to be a bit careful. You definitely don't want to be too pushy. But being cheeky sometimes works. QuizUp is offering free pizza for everyone who clicks on the push notification. You can't do that too often because they're obviously not going to get a free pizza out of it. But it's worth a try. But yeah, it's a tough problem. Better to do churn prevention and try and identify those users before they abandon the app than to try and win them back afterwards. It's always really tough. And yeah, finally, I've got just a couple of examples of driving up purchase and subscriptions. So you've got your sort of standard abandoned cart type model. E-commerce companies tend to do this really well. They also tend to employ a lot of fairly sophisticated machine learning to do really good recommendations on products. And if you've got an e-commerce business, you're probably already pretty good at this. For a lot of other apps, they're trying to getting into monetization, often by trying to sell subscriptions. And that's what we see here with the Headspace example. This is something we built for them. It's essentially a very flexible in-app tool, which they can then use. They can customize all of this stuff and actually customize it for different segments based on what they know about the user. They can test different images, different upsell benefits, and really sell the subscription differently to different parts, different segments of their user base, and even test different pricing, all within an in-app message. So it means the growth market is in full control, and you can iterate on this stuff really quickly. If you build this stuff natively, it never gets iterated on. It gets built once, and then you're stuck with it, and you've got basically, yeah, you have very little control over your ability to upsell users more effectively. And I would just say also, be a little bit careful of what we see in the bottom right here. This is an example of an e-commerce company that I think, personally for me at least, was a little bit too high frequency, at like a lot of special offers, but I was getting multiple of these per day. You know, there's only so many times the user is going to buy something. So particularly if you see that they're not responding to notifications, you might want to turn them down a bit. Finally, I've put this matrix together. I can send this out to you if anyone's interested. I think it's on our website somewhere at mobilegrowthstack.com. But I can also give you this if you want to grab me later. But it's not terribly insightful, but it's quite a useful summary of just which are the different channels that you might use in CRM and the different kind of applications for that in terms of which ones you can use to reach active users versus inactive and things like that. All right, I just managed to finish this almost on time. I've got 33 seconds to explain a life cycle plan. So a lot of information on here, but I just want to call out typically when we come in and audit an existing CRM setup, there's already campaigns in place. So the first thing we do is actually look at how they're all performing, set up control groups against them and see what impact they're really driving. So this is, we always build a map like this, and then look for, first of all, which are the campaigns that are not performing that we might want to replace entirely, but also look where there are gaps in the life cycle where maybe there are other opportunities to launch brand new campaigns. So I'd encourage you all to build one of these out. We don't see many companies actually having this kind of overview of what they're actually sending to users, and it's important. All right, that's it. I didn't leave any time for Q&A, but maybe we have time for one or two questions. I don't know. Questions? Anyone? All right, well, then I'm done. Thanks.